Welcome back to the Lady Tech Africa podcast, and this is the Future Forward series that has been created in celebration of the National Science Week. And this year's theme is Living in a High-Tech World. Should we be concerned? And today we'll be talking about a different topic, which is ethical technology use, balancing innovation and responsibility in the face of AI. And on today's episode, we have Nerushka Bowan, who is a technology and privacy lawyer who uses her understanding of the law and technology combined with her passion for innovation and knowledge sharing to empower others about the complexities of emerging technologies and the future of law. Nerushka has also led AI research projects and is globally renowned for her work in AI. And she has also co-authored a chapter titled Artificial Intelligence, Legal Ethics and Public Policy in the international publication AI and the Legal Profession, Transforming the Future of Law. Nerushka is also the founder of the Lit Institute, which she will talk to us about later. Hi, Nerushka. Welcome to the platform.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat to you today. And sorry for getting you out in this cold weather today.
It's
of
okay.
Joburg. Joburg is becoming Cape Town.
Exactly.
So I have 3 questions that I've put together for us to kind of get to know you,
Sure.
without asking you the dreaded question, which I personally dread. You know, the question they ask at interviews. Tell us about yourself. They need to find creative ways of getting to know people without asking that question. So the first one is, if you could send a letter to someone in the future about your life, what key moments would you highlight?
Sure. I think for me, it's probably going to be a lot of personal milestones in terms of family life, my child, things like that, I think will be highlights that you can't surpass. But I do at the same breath have a lot of pride and joy in my business. It's also something that I've created and something that's come from me. So I'll definitely speak about that. And just also talk about milestones in the sense of not achievements in terms of, getting this award or getting this promotion or getting this job title, but more about finding purpose in life. And I think as we go through life, and sometimes the challenges we have give us more meaning to life and to purpose than all the good times. So yes, I will highlight some significant personal milestones, business milestones, but I also think all the challenges that led us up to the purpose of life, I think is sometimes even more important. So somebody in the future, I'd want to share perhaps some nuggets of purpose.
Yeah, I love that. And when you mention also, when you start something from scratch, which I always find fascinating, that when people create things, no matter how small they are, it's fascinating to me that this was something in your mind at one point and now it exists in the world. So I always find that very fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And the second question is, what's one belief or value that's remained constant throughout your life, and how has that value guided your decisions?
Sure. So for me, I think it would be authenticity, and not because I've gotten it right. I think a lot of the challenges in my life came from in a place where I felt like I needed to fit in to a space. So I would say, yes, we need to be authentic, but then in the same breath, feel like I needed to change to adapt to different environments, whatever that may have been, whether it's school or social environments or work environments, always feeling the need to do more or be something else to fit in. And what that just ultimately led to is when you're not yourself, you take a lot of energy trying to be something you're not. And that ultimately drives you to things like burnout. You can't do everything. You can't be the best version of yourself if you're constantly trying to be somebody else. And so authenticity for me is quite important, because the more authentic I am, like everything else becomes a lot easier. And it's just a constant reminder and almost like a grounding to say, remember to be authentic, because every time you're authentic, things work out. But whenever you lose track of that value and you skid to the other side, all these other things start happening.
Yeah.
I
love that. And I definitely resonate with that. When I was a quiet and reserved child, and to a certain extent, I still have those qualities. And, when you get into the workplace, you kind of feel the need to act out extroverted.
Yes.
But there's also a lot of qualities that come with being who you are. And fortunately, over the years, I've learned how to navigate that space, even in my quiet disposition, I guess.
Yeah, I think the workspace is built around the extroverted personality, and you're told to get further, you have to network and talk to people and do this and do this. And it's very out of your comfort zone, but then you basically told, if you don't do all these things, you're not going to succeed. So you then feel, okay, I have to be this person I'm not. And what I found my way of doing it was through social media, because I was then able to network and connect with lots of people without draining my energy. But still achieving the purpose of building a brand, doing all the things that they said we should do. But I found a way to do it that I could still be authentic to myself without being there in the conference talking to, like, I'm not that person. I'd rather be on the stage and then the 100 people must come to me and ask me. I don't want to go to you. And that takes so much of energy, me going to you, but you coming to me, it's easy.
It's better for you, It's
so that's how I kind of found my way to do it authentically, and may not be the way they teach you, but it achieves the purpose and it works for me.
Yeah, I love that. And the third question is, picture a roadmap of your life. What would the most surprising detour be?
So many detours. This is going to be like a very... You're trying to get to A to B, but you're like going all the other... No, I just think like, what can I say? You always have a plan in your head, like, oh, this is where you're going, this is what I'm going to be. But like, it very rarely goes there. And if you're always holding on to this preconceived idea of what life should be in your mind, you're going to have a very difficult life, because you're going to always be fighting for something that maybe is not for you. But I think the universe tries to guide you on your path. And so if you become more aware and open, you'll realize, if you just look for the signs, you'll know where your path is. But as long as you try and like get things, I mean, if you just look at my career, like never did I say I'm going to become a lawyer or any of this stuff. It was never the plan. Like life just happened to me, growing up as a child, it was like astronaut. And then all of a sudden it became engineer. And then it was for a stage actuary, because they made the most money. And then ended up in law, almost like a gap year, but then stayed, and now became a then I was like, oh, I'll study law, but I won't practice. I'll go to a bank or something. But then I practiced for a long time, and then eventually found my path within. And then obviously practice wasn't for me either, but then I found my path and actually had to make my own path ultimately, something that suited me, and coming back to authenticity, because I didn't fit the mold of what was the expectation out there in the field that I was in. I had to detour again to find the path that makes sense for me. And even within this path, it's going to keep changing, because as my life changes and my needs change and I change as a person, at least now I have the flexibility for my business to grow and change with me, as opposed to being in a situation where you expect it to be the same for a long period of time. So I would say there's been a number of detours in that sense, especially on the career front. But, all of those detours ultimately lead you to where you need to be.
So it's been like a jungle gym of a journey, basically.
Exactly.
With a lot of detours, but you still get to where you're going. I absolutely love that. And I guess like we need to get to a point where we embrace those detours, because ultimately they will get us to where we need to be. I love that. And it's quite interesting that you mentioned that you actually initially wanted to be an astronaut and all these other things, but you landed in the legal space. So in today's episode, we'll be discussing the ethical technology use and balancing innovation and responsibility in the face of AI. Now, someone once said that, think of legal as existing in all other industries, right? Because every other industry, there's always regulations and framework that govern it. So you are a technology and privacy lawyer and also doing a lot of work as well in the AI space. How did you land then at the intersection of tech, innovation, and the law?
Yeah, sure. So, I think the one thing that kept me in law was the fact that it's across industries. Whereas I felt if I had to pivot into another industry, I would be locked in an industry. And I couldn't see the future where, what if I wasn't happy and then you kind of locked? Whereas with law, I saw, well, you can like kind of change your job by changing industry or changing focus. You're in banking, you don't like banking, you go to health. If you don't like health, you go here. But your base skill is the same, but you are able to then explore a lot more. Tech was again not part of the plan. When I did my articles, we had a lovely program where we rotated to different departments every 6 months. So it kind of just gave us that exposure. When I was studying, I didn't even know tech law was even a thing, you know, like you just like have this narrow view of the world when you're a student. Then I get into the real world and I, get into the small team that's doing like tech and didn't even know what was it about. And then when I started working in the field, realized it's so interesting because of all the uncertainties in the tech space. It makes the legal and regulatory part even more interesting because almost every day you kind of have to be creative and come up with stuff because there's a lot of gaps. It's not like some other industries where everything's written in a law or there's templates for all the contracts or, and it's a lot more like cut and paste. Here, there was just like a lot of unknowns and a lot of creativity, and there were also new techs developing every day. So what you learned yesterday about the cloud is fine, but like tomorrow you have to know about crypto, then you have to know about social media, then you have to know about whatever's the next big thing. You have to figure out quickly, what is it? How does it work? How does it impact our clients? What are the risks? You have to like unpack the whole thing in addition. So for me, that continuous learning was like very appealing because it meant like I'm going to always be stimulated. I'm not going to be bored because it's not like I learned my job and now I'm just going to just repeat it every day. It's like something new. So that kept me. And then the other thing and how the innovation piece came in is I also then, as I got more access to technology, started to say, okay, but how can we actually do the practice of law differently? Because these are all these cool things happening in the world. Why not in this industry? And so I fell down that rabbit hole. And once I kind of went down that rabbit hole, it was very difficult for me to do things the way they've always been done. It was a lot of questioning the system. Why are we doing it like this? In 10 years from now, do we need this? In 50 years from now, what does a law firm look like? And then I ended up spending a lot of my time in the future reimagining the practice of law, given what I'm aware of the tech that we have and where I can see the tech going and where I can see innovation going. And so then to be pulled back to earth and say, you have to build these hours and draft this contract was a big disconnect for me. Because I'm like, this is not important. What's important is we need to build this thing for the future. And like, if we're not doing it now, we're going to get left behind. And then almost feeling like isolation because a lot of people couldn't even understand what I was trying to preach a lot of the time. So I even forgot what the question was. Oh, how did I end up at that intersection? The privacy piece happened also quite organically because when I was kind of a junior lawyer, privacy was a new field in South Africa with the Protection of Personal Information Act. So I got the opportunity then to go learn from lawyers in London, learn from lawyers in Australia, bring that expertise back here to build a new area of law, privacy law, and kind of work that. So I just got lucky in terms of being in that space at a time where it was like very new. We didn't have local expertise, and being the one that kind of brought back some global expertise. So the privacy, the tech, And then, the innovation kind of all came together. And I'm still, all those areas interest me. And that's basically what I do. And I'm still trying to preach to whoever will listen about these topics. And then, of course, at the moment, I speak the most about AI because that's where we are right now. And we're in this next revolution. And almost every second day, we're getting a massive change in terms of how AI is working, what it can do now, 2 days ago we'll be like, oh, this thing is useless, it can't do this, and then all of a sudden there's an update and boom, it can do it. Just now again reimagining the practice of law with this lens, it's mind-blowing. And then you just think, I hope people are taking these things seriously and innovating.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And the fact that, I think early on you were able to carve out your own career and not follow the natural or the normal route that we are told to follow, that you're a lawyer, you're going to go into practice. Even me, when you think of lawyers, you think of them in your black... What do they call that? That regalia you wear.
That go to court. You wear the black
that's
robes.
The picture that you have. But what technology is doing is opening up all these other avenues where you can go into and still practice law being your foundation or your base skill, but also the ability to, also have that creativity and innovative side into your... and I guess you are also quite inquisitive then. You're always wanting to learn. You're always trying to see what's happening out there, which is not like your normal mix, And I admire that you were able to remain true to that for yourself, and not follow the normal route that we are always told to follow. Now, you also touched on, technology is always evolving, but now with the rise of AI, it's also evolving quite quickly.
Yeah.
And even with me being in the industry, I've started thinking about my own skill set, that actually, what does AI actually mean even for me? And currently people don't have the psychological safety around AI. And this is caused mainly because we don't fully understand what AI actually means for us, right? In terms of, especially in terms of our careers, our businesses, and also how AI is going to impact societies. So I want us to start by demystifying some of the misinformation around artificial intelligence, right? Firstly, what is AI in your view? What is it?
So, the word AI or artificial intelligence is being used at the moment to describe just about everything. So sometimes it can be difficult to know what is AI. And the word itself is an old word. So I guess that's also why it's been applied to just about everything. It was coined all the way back in the 1950s. It's not a new term. And we've seen development of AI-like things over the years, and everybody calling, because, it was trendy to do so, get investments from funds if you're building an AI something. And so that's why we've seen this word pop up all the time. Now, the way I like to define AI is when we start giving non-human things human capabilities. So the first one is obviously this kind of thinking capability. So we've fed these models lots of information, and now they can almost absorb all of that information and come up with some conclusion. It might be a decision or a finding or creating something new. It's giving it some kind of human-like capability to think. Then if you look at your self-driving vehicle, we're giving it the ability to see the environment around us, to hear the environment around us, and then navigate a pathway through that AI capability that we've given to the self-driving vehicle. And similarly, if you look at all of these smart devices that are being AI enhanced, there's some kind of human-like capability we're giving them. So in the robotics, it's movement, it's touch that we're trying to replicate. So it's so the human would be the kind of natural, biological, real, and then anything we try to replicate will be the artificial version of that. Of course, now if you start looking at regulations, we've got these official definitions, and the word they use there is AI system. And it really talks about something machine-based, something that requires an input, something that creates an output, something that can influence others, whether it's virtual or physical. And those are the type of definitions we're seeing now emerge from a regulatory perspective.
Oh yeah, that's quite interesting. But also like it explains it in a non-technical way, because I mean technology on its own is, people find it quite intimidating. Now all of this artificial intelligence talks, people are just not understanding it even further. So how then do we get people from a point where they are intimidated by this thing that they don't even understand to a point where, I mean, you don't have to be like a software engineer or whatever, but just to a point where you have your own understanding of what this is and what it actually means for you?
So I don't think everyone needs to know exactly how things work. I mean, take the internet, for example. Very few people know how the internet works. Actually, some people don't even know they're undersea cables that are physically connecting the internet. We just assume like Wi-Fi and, like that's it. Everything's happening in the cloud in some way. We don't even know how something as basic as the internet, which is like integrated 100% into our lives. We completely dependent on the internet for our livelihoods, for everything. And we don't know how it works. We don't know how our phones work. We don't know how cellular works. We don't know how 5G works. But we adopt these technologies into our lives and we use them. So similarly with AI, we don't need to know at a very detailed level how the algorithms are made, how the models work, how the data scientists do X, Y, and Z. I mean, these are really complex things. And the people who are building these things are like super geniuses that are putting this all together. So not all of us have to be at that level. What we do need to know is the impact it's going to have on our lives, what we need to be doing as individuals to upskill ourselves, and the risks involved and the ethical issues involved in using these tools. Similar with social media, perhaps it hit us quite quickly, and before we could even realize all the risks involved, we're already like social media addicts, and we've got people who have crazy screen time, addicted to YouTube, addicted to social media, addicted to likes. This is also a psychological concept now of if you didn't get enough likes on something, then you can get depressed, and like getting online bullying and cyberbullying. So it's all of the social media is great, it's a lovely tool, but with any tool that we have in our lives, we need to know there's pros and cons, there's opportunities and risks. And we need to establish that, take a knife. You can use that knife in the kitchen and you're going to create a gourmet meal. Somebody can use that same knife and stab somebody. The knife hasn't changed. The knife's still a tool. The knife has opportunities in the kitchen for creating beautiful meals. The knife has risks that it could be used in grievous bodily harm by somebody who wants to stab somebody else. The knife hasn't changed. Social media, very similar. We have huge opportunities for networking, connecting with people all over the world, sharing our message. This podcast is going to go onto the internet and anybody anywhere can now access this. It's beautiful. But then we also have people trying to kidnap other people. We have people engaging in child sexual abuse material. We have so much of underhanded stuff happening on the internet. It's the tool, and how you use the tool ultimately is what remains. So AI, it's a tool. It's going to have huge opportunities. Try and understand what those opportunities are and leverage them for yourself. But when you're in that environment, also understand there's risks here. What are those risks? Bias, discrimination, hallucinations, privacy, security. What do those risks mean for me and the use cases I'm doing? And how do I mitigate against those risks? You want to be like, because something has risks doesn't mean we're not going to use it. We drive our cars every day. There's risks involved. We fly in planes. We do a lot of things that have risk. Just because something has risks doesn't mean we're not going to do it. We need to know what the risks are so we can take steps to mitigate the risks. So that's ultimately what AI is. And you don't have to know at a very detailed level how it works. You need to know enough to understand the risks, to take steps to mitigate the risks while leveraging the opportunities.
And then I guess my next question would be, what is it not? Because, also how it's communicated in social media and across, the news platforms, etc. It gives the perception that it's this thing that's just going to take over our lives and we'll start running our lives. robots are going to take over our lives. And you know what happens then to humanity. So what is it not in terms of, artificial intelligence and the technology, and how, I guess, we'll be working side by side with it instead of thinking that it's going to take over.
So you know what? This is definitely a philosophical question, and there's many schools of thought in terms of where we could end up. I would say right now where we are viewing it as a tools for humans to do things possibly in a better way. We're not viewing it as something that's going to take over everything. We're viewing it as a tool, and how do we best use this tool? How do we best mitigate risk from this tool? Now, we may cross a threshold where, and OpenAI calls it, so OpenAI is the creators of ChatGPT, they call it the 5 levels to AGI. Now, AGI is the tipping point where we can say an AI is better at a human at everything. So now we have AI that's better at humans at specific things. So maybe calculating a large sum, you give it to a human, you give it to an AI, the AI is going to do it in 2 seconds, the human's going to do it in 2 minutes. We can find specific tasks where the AI is going to beat us every time, right? When we hit AGI, it means the AI is going to beat us at all the tasks. Whatever we put in front of a human and an AI, the AI will always get it better, do it better, do it accurately, do it right, do it faster, whatever metric you want to measure it, the AI will be better, and we're getting there. Now, they say from the 5 levels that they've called the 5 levels to AGI, the first one was chatbots, which is ChatGPT, which we had all the way like 2 years ago. We're familiar with AI chatbots. The next one was reasoning, and we reached this milestone 3-4 days ago with the latest version of ChatGPT 4.0 preview. It has the level of reasoning of a PhD student. So you would have called your normal ChatGPT like first year university student, making mistakes in the assignment, not reading all the material, that guy. That was ChatGPT. Now they've released the PhD version of ChatGPT, which is looks at all the material, studies, critically thinks about things, comes up with solutions, logical, can reason. So we're already at level 2. And the prediction is that we're going to go quicker to 3, 4, and 5. So it took us about 2 years to get from level 1 to level 2. But the gap between level 2 and 3 is agents. So what you said, AI taking over, these are now AI agents. You give them a task and they will just achieve the task, whatever the task might be. So instead of hiring an assistant to reply to emails and book meetings for you or whatever, you train an AI agent to read your emails, you teach them the tone, how to respond, you teach them how to book meetings in your calendar, whatever it is that you need the agent to do. So now you don't need a VA or a PA anymore. You've got the AI agent and they're running your inbox, and you just check it, once a day just to make sure everything is going well. And that's your AI agent. So that's level 3. That's the next step to AGI. And they say it's shorter than 2 years. We're going to get there. And so when we start getting to that world now, where the AIs are running things, and we're going to start giving them bigger and bigger and bigger things to run as they get smarter and smarter and smarter. And as you start getting close at level 5 AGI, that's when things are going to start getting tricky, because we will be able to create the AGI, but the super intelligent AI is going to be created by the AI itself. So we'll get here, we'll make it as smart as humans. And then from there, all the development that happens is going to be the AI creating the smarter versions of itself. And we don't actually know what's going to happen after that and how far it's going to go and where is it going to lead us. There's many unanswered questions there. There's many debates, ethical debates. Some people very firmly in the position of it's a tool, it has no consciousness, it's never going to get, it's not a real person. We are making it a person, but it's not a person. It's just a piece of code. It's nothing. And then we have the other extreme, which is, once it gets smart enough, it's going to take over. So
Sure. Yeah, it's a lot of things to digest when it comes to this topic, honestly. And I guess then my next question, as it's advancing and doing all these amazing things that we never even thought of, what role do legal frameworks play then in ensuring that AI systems are developed and deployed ethically? And what more can be done to encourage responsible innovation, because the tech guy creating stuff, they don't always care about like the end user, how it's going to be experienced, even when it's not like your AI, any other innovation, people are just the creators or the innovators mostly care about the tech itself and what it can do, but they really consider how it's going to impact the person at the end who will be interacting, or your invention, how will it impact society, you know what I mean? So how then, what role do legal frameworks in that regard play in ensuring that AI systems are developed and deployed ethically, and what more can be done to encourage responsible innovation?
So it is very difficult to regulate for ethics specifically. So what our laws try and achieve is usually a risk mitigation and reducing liability and things going wrong. So laws will try and say, okay, these things are being created. What are the possible things that go wrong, and what laws can we put in place to prevent these things from going wrong? So if you look at things like the EU AI Act, they would want transparency obligations. So if you're creating bots that are going to interact with your customers, the customer needs to know they're interacting with the bot, not because now they're getting so smart.
Yeah.
You can't actually tell the difference, whether it's a phone call or a text. You don't know if you're talking to a human. So they're trying to introduce things like transparency, and then conformity assessments before you deploy a product that has AI to make sure it meets a certain standards and requirements. Code of conduct for these large language models like ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini, and they need to adhere to a set of code of conduct. So those are being drafted at the moment. So there's these type of things that they're trying to establish. It's not kind of after the fact, because we already have a lot of these tools in the market. And what's very interesting development is that the EU right now is probably one of the heaviest regulators when it comes to big tech in terms of privacy regulation, e-commerce, all the digital stuff. It's got about 5 or 6 different regulations that apply to that space. And then now obviously the EU AI Act coming into force. What we've seen the big tech companies do is not say, okay, we're going to take all these regulations and figure out how to comply. They're actually saying we're cutting the EU out of our market. So examples, when Facebook released the new version of their large language model, they have a model called Llama, which is an open source model. When they released Llama 2, which obviously has been using user stuff that you post across your Meta profile. So Meta is Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. They own multiple social media companies, and they've used some of that information to train these models. They decided not to release it in the EU because now there's so many of these regulations that they may be tripping. They don't want to get a big fine, so they're just offering it outside of the EU. Then Apple launched Apple Intelligence. So the new 16s that have just launched, now 16 Pro, come with Apple Intelligence. If you buy an Apple 16 in the EU, there's no Apple Intelligence. They did not release the AI model. So you just get a normal 16 Pro. Again, because of all these legislative requirements, they've just decided, instead of figuring out how to comply, we'll just leave this market out. And EU is not a small market. It's a big first world market in the grand scheme of things, especially for purchases of things like an iPhone. So it's very interesting to see how the response has been to regulation. It hasn't been, we're going to implement all these bells and whistles to try and comply. It's actually been, this doesn't seem, I'm not going to get it right. It's too complex. And so let's just leave them out. And I don't blame them, in the sense that with the GDPR, which we've had for a couple of years now, from their perspective, the big techs, they've tried to comply, but every year they're getting fined millions and millions of dollars. And maybe they just saying, we try to comply with these EU laws, but we don't even know, where's the line in the sand, because we're always falling short. And so now they've cut the market out. So yes, we have this attempt by regulation to install these measures in place. Whether they always work practically is a very different thing. Sometimes they end up being more like a tick book exercise. Like, think about privacy. You're like, oh, I've got a privacy policy. I did a poppy training. I'm compliant. But that's not what it's about. It's about actually caring for the data that you're holding of your customers, treating that data with dignity and respect, and not doing things that you shouldn't be doing, like selling it to third parties or, mishandling that data. There's a deeper meaning. It comes from our basic human rights.
Yeah.
But how it happens in practice is like a tick box of, I've got this document, I did this training, I'm POPIA compliant. So you end up, maybe the reasons start ethical and human rights based, and the reasons why we put these laws are, we have the right intentions, but by the time we get to the actual black and white law and how people implement the law, I can't really say it's achieving the purpose of those companies now saying we ethical. Ethics is a completely different, it's a mindset, it's an intention to be an ethical organization.
Sure. Yeah. You've said a mouthful there. There's a lot of things. And even us as consumers, I mean, we are always agreeing to the T's and C's, but I don't think
nobody. And
reads.
I think there've been
word
studies.
For word, those T's and C's, all 100 points of what the terms and conditions are that you are signing up for. And I sometimes think, even if I read through them, I think our need to use the thing outweighs our need to know what actually we are signing up for.
100%. And I think there's been studies shown, like, it's going to take you most of the year if you actually read every single thing. It's actually, it's not even practical to read everything. And then when companies try to tell you what they're doing, it often causes a consumer outrage because we're so used to not knowing what's happening with our data. When WhatsApp tried to tell us in a short little 3 bullet points, it became a whole let's boycott WhatsApp. And I'm like, they actually now tell, usually they don't tell you, they just change it. They'll send you an email, we've updated our privacy policy. You don't know what they've updated. When they try to tell you what you've updated, then you're like, what? You're going to do this with my data? I'm not going to use it. Now LinkedIn's going through the same thing because LinkedIn put in a toggle to allow you to opt out of AI using your data to being trained, which they probably thought is like a positive, but it's actually then ended up in outrage. How dare they opt me in without me knowing that I was opted in. So it's become like this whole thing. So it's privacy compliance it's a minefield because sometimes when you tell your customer, all you end up doing is outraging them because they don't actually know how things work, but it was all there in your privacy policy the whole time. It's just that nobody reads them. So nobody's actually, there's no transparency, there's no notification in how things are being done today. So that whole system needs an overhaul.
Yeah, sure. That's quite interesting. And what is the GDPR?
So the GDPR...
And what does it, in our context, I guess, particularly in South Africa, and I suppose across the continent.
Yeah.
What is it?
So GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's something that comes out of the EU, so the European Union, which is a conglomerate of most of the European countries.
Yeah.
And it basically has set, I would say, the global standard for data privacy regulation in the world. And any business doing business with EU-based customers will have to comply with the GDPR. So it goes beyond its borders in the sense that you could be a South African-based business but have customers in the EU. And now, because you're now entering that market to do business with customers in the EU without actually establishing a presence in the EU, you've triggered that law. And now you also have to comply from wherever you are in the world. Now, in addition to that, we've seen laws coming up across the continent in Africa that's starting to mirror what's in the GDPR. So now we're getting data protection regulations localized, but having a very strong flavor of what's happening in the EU. We call it the Brussels effect. When something the Brussels, publishes something, through their processes, and then we see it popping up all over the world. And so really it's a EU thing, but it's had a global impact because of the way it was drafted, and because anybody who wants to do business with EU ends up having to comply with this. And so a lot of South African companies, operate at a global level.
Yes.
And so they have to comply with the standard of the GDPR. Now, if you look at your POPIA, it's very similar, but not as detailed as a GDPR.
Okay.
And so sometimes, especially local companies will say, okay, we'll kind of do our GDPR compliance because it's more extensive. And then almost we are also complying with POPIA by implementing these measures. There's a few things unique to POPIA that is actually more strict. So if you're doing that, you do have to still take into account the stricter measures because you're a South African organization. Your local, laws take preference. But yeah, that's basically what the GDPR is.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that are trying, to govern all these, particularly in the data protection space, to kind of protect our data. But obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard.
Yeah, I think there's that disconnect between the laws trying to protect our data and with what happens practically. There's still that disconnect because the fact that these big fines of millions and millions of dollars still happen every year to the companies that are holding most of our data, the Googles, the Facebooks, all the big ones, just shows that, yes, the laws are there, but what's actually, are they all being complied with? Are they practical to be complied with? That's the other thing. Sometimes the practicality of compliance is close to impossible, and they're just like, oh, well.
Let's do it anyway.
Let's do it anyway.
Yeah. Well, those are some things that we need to be thinking about as we navigate all of the digital space, because it's going to keep, getting more and more. So when we were at the Women in Tech Meet, you mentioned something so important. Well, I found it too important to me, that AI tools are also a reflection of the people who created them. Right. So can you expand on that, and how can these innovators be held accountable as they create these tools, and how can we mitigate or manage the risk that come with the biases that are built with the tools?
It's quite important. So I was talking specifically about the new generative AI tools.
Yes.
And how we've now seen the kind of philosophical outlook of the founders and the developers of those tools also being reflected in the outputs we get from those tools.
Yes.
So if we take our ChatGPT, for example, created by OpenAI, there's a number of guardrails in place. And who decides what those guardrails are? The people who built the tool. Who decides what it can and can't say? There's some jokes it deems inappropriate. It is some content it refuses to answer. There's been studies and people have demoed this online, where it will answer questions about Kamala Harris but refuse to answer question about Donald Trump. So is this now a left-leaning generative AI tool? But if this tool is just meant to be an open global tool, why is it taking a political position, whichever side it may be? Does now that show there's some bias built in by the founders of the tool that are making it lean and put guardrails in like one direction? And so Elon Musk kind of created his own tool in response to these type of things, basically saying that this is censorship, the fact that all these guardrails have been put in place. And so he's created something called Grok, which he calls the freedom of speech tool. But then again, it also reflects his philosophical outlook. And he's kind of given it the sarcastic personality, and there's still guardrails in place, but he's decided what the guardrails are. And his people that are built this tool have decided where the lines are. So yes, it may be more free than the other tools, but it's still biased to his outlook on the world. And it's also trained on X. So the people who post on X also have a particular outlook on life and things. And so it's swayed in bias in terms of that type of content. And so we have to now critically evaluate the outputs we're getting from this tool. So there's two types of bias we're dealing with. The first bias is the data. So remember, it's been trained on data, the data of the world, the data you can find on Google, very, very large volumes of data.
Yes.
Now, that data is also largely Western-centric in nature.
Mhm.
So if you look at our localized type of information, some of that just would not have existed in that data, local languages, local information, anything about us. And so now we are using these tools, but we are like not part of the tools at the same time, if you understand what I'm trying to say, because
yeah.
we're such a small part of it. And that's, I mean, the fact is the data just did not exist for them to train on it, but it creates these type of biases, and then any stereotype you can think of in the world is further amplified within these tools as well. And so Google tried to undo some of these stereotypes, and they went their own way, trying to be a very woke generative AI tool and put in a lot of guardrails to prevent it from showing, usually if you say successful business person, it's going to show you like a white man. So they put in a guardrails to prevent that. So if you say successful business person, you're going to see a wide variety of different looking people,
Yes.
somebody that looks like you, somebody that looks like your neighbor,
Yeah.
a nice set. However, what ended up backfiring is it also became completely historically inaccurate. So if you said, give me an image of a Nazi, you were going to get, Asian female, black male, all sorts of different types of people, but nobody that actually looked like what a Nazi would have looked like. If we said the Pope, you were not going to get somebody that looks like the Pope. So it was now not even showing you white males. It went the other extreme. So they had to pull that attempt at figuring out the stereotyping thing. So we have that bias in the underlying data. We have to be cognizant of that. And then we have the bias of the people building the tools and their philosophical background and their morals and values being inputted in the guardrails of those tools. So the output we finally get is influenced by all of this. So just being aware of that helps you then evaluate and critically analyze the output and say, actually, maybe this is a bit skewed and not suitable for my purpose. So we just have to be mindful of that.
Yeah. So I guess that also goes back to building your own AI acumen, I suppose. As we engage with these tools, be mindful of that. It has all of these biases that are also embedded in the tool. So as we use it, we then need to take on the responsibility of using it responsibly. Yeah. So what are the key challenges then in regulating data collection and usage by AI systems, particularly in sectors like your healthcare and your finance space?
So in those spaces at the moment, I would say a lot of that stuff is happening in-house. So we wouldn't necessarily find large data sets within the publicly available large language models unless they've reached some agreement with to get access to that private information. A lot of the information in there is public information. So if you're looking within a banking environment, for example, they are building some of their own models with their own data to run, in terms of preventing fraud or creating new customer experiences, optimizing various things. We're seeing a lot of that happening just within the bank as opposed to, so now there's also now this move towards open banking, where you can almost access the results of the data sets of other banks without getting access to the confidential and personal information of the customer. So there are ways and means that they are working in the open banking space, because we want the data, because the data creates the smart algorithms and the smart models that can ultimately achieve the bigger purpose. But we also have duties of confidentiality and privacy to prevent our information, competition laws that prevents, information coming together. And so in this open banking space, they are now looking at ways, how do we actually leverage the data, learn from each other in a way that we can do it, that everything, the actual data still stays anonymous. So that's one area. And then in the healthcare space, again, we're seeing huge movements in these almost like small language models where they're trained on particular use cases. So one where they're showing huge promise is early cancer detection. So these are now models that are trained on x-rays of patients, like early x-rays and full-blown cancer x-rays, and the AI is able to predict cancer earlier than the naked human eye. So if a doctor just looks at it, they can't see it.
Yes.
But if the AI looks at it, the AI will say there's cancer going to develop there, and then the cancer develops there. So stuff like that we're seeing in healthcare has been mind-blowing as a tool for doctors to help their patients. Because remember, early detection can save lives.
Absolutely.
Ultimately. So that's the type of stuff we're seeing in the healthcare that's really showing a lot of promise.
Sure. Yeah. So there is some good that's happening that's coming with AI. And how do South African laws or laws within the African continent regulate the transfer of personal data across borders in the context of AI technologies, especially with companies? You mentioned earlier that, companies now are global companies. And I imagine that anyone that's creating something, they are no longer just creating it for where we are geographically, but we are creating something that, can be scalable across the globe. So what laws are in place?
So over the last couple of years, a number of African jurisdictions implemented data privacy regulations. So we do have a lot more regulation to navigate when we're trying to figure this out on the continent and, cross-border especially. There's some jurisdictions that are quite strict in the fact that they don't want data to leave their borders. And this becomes very difficult to do business in this cloud world we live in.
Yes.
If you don't have a local data center in your country that can house that data, it has to leave your border if you want to use many of the tools available, because most of these tools are now running in the cloud.
Yes.
So South Africa recently, like a year or two, got Microsoft Cloud. Then we got Amazon, but for AWS. But for a number of years, we didn't have any proper massive local infrastructure, and a lot of our data we would choose Europe or Ireland or Germany.
Yes.
Or if you weren't too bothered about where your data goes, you'd use the US in terms of where your cloud is stored. Now, what multinational companies are finding in these African jurisdictions where they're like, the data must not leave, you actually miss out on some of the tech advances, because then you can't deploy certain cloud-based applications. You can't deploy certain AI technologies that require data to leave the jurisdiction.
Yes.
And so you actually then have to just use what you can in that jurisdiction. So you can then, by having overly restrictive laws, miss out on some of these tech advances if your data is not allowed to leave your jurisdiction. So that's some of the impact that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I imagine some of our, the African countries are going to be left behind even more, because there's some that are still slow to cloud adoption because of the reasons that you've mentioned, that they don't want their data leaving their jurisdiction.
Yes.
And how do they manage that? How do then they bring these technological advancement if they don't want that? Then it means that they can't. Then they'll be left behind even further with all this innovation that's happening.
100%.
So that's really interesting to see. So you've also done work in leading AI research projects. What has been some of the critical findings that we are not necessarily hearing about in most of the AI content that's out there at the moment?
So I'll tell you one theme that came up quite a lot, and this is not an AI issue, but I'm just going to mention it because it is quite an important one to me. I did do a research project where we interviewed a number of local AI startups and people, we have such brilliant people in this country doing such amazing things. That's one thing I want to say. We're not short of talent by any means. And they are at a turning point where they want to grow as businesses. They are now seeking funding. A lot of the funding is coming from overseas, perhaps US investors and others. And now there's this question of bringing the funds into the country. And US investors are hesitant to put money into the country. And reasons for that are around our exchange control laws. We have very strict exchange control laws with regards to money leaving the country, but also money coming into the country. It's not even easy to bring money in. It's very, very complicated. And we also have a lot of exchange control laws around our intellectual property. Intellectual property leaving the country is seen as an export and requires Reserve Bank approval, and it's a very complicated scenario. Now, if you as an external investor are coming into this market and putting money in here with all these regulatory issues, you kind of said, okay, maybe I wouldn't. And so what are these companies are now being forced to do is to create an offshore entity, either in Mauritius or Delaware or some other island. And then the funds are going into the offshore entity. And then now they, just in order for them to receive investments for them to grow. And we keep talking about growing our economy, having homegrown innovation, local tech entrepreneurs, building our own AI hubs locally. We're not short of the talent. We're not short of the opportunity. We're not short of the people. We're not short of the business. This is where we run short. We are falling short because the money is not coming into the country because of our exchange control laws. These laws were put in place for the days of from like the 60s, when people used to go across the border with bags of money. That's when these laws were passed. And we are still dealing with these laws today. And it's holding us back, I feel, as a country, and preventing investments here. So many, like every company I speak to, as soon as they reach that point where they need to get bigger, end up going offshore. And not because they want to be South African companies, but but
because they can't get the funding into the country, then they have to, they're kind of put in they're in between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Because it's either, I imagine or I assume that they would either need to shut down or consider those offshore.
Yeah, or just stay like a little small business, like to grow and scale and have that become this bigger business that we want to grow and boom in the economy. We want to create jobs. We want to do all the things. We want to be a leader, but we are still holding ourselves back through this. And I don't know when is this going to change, but this is a pattern, and a strong pattern I've heard many, many times for people, and especially entrepreneurs trying to grow business. Yeah.
And we are also a country that's saying that a lot of our economic growth will come from entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Sure. Hopefully someone's listening that has influence in that space. So let's talk accessibility of data for research purposes, particularly. That, they have to go to countries like China where the data is readily available to train these models. How, in your view, can we also, as not only South Africa, but as the African continent, reach a point where we also have enough data available through research that these models can be trained on the correct data that reflects us as Africans?
So it's a twofold question. The first one is having the data but are not allowing the researchers access to the data. So I'll give you like a simple one. Somebody just wanted access to weather data for their research. And somebody wanted access to data from the news from the SABC archives. Simple things that were refused and forced these researchers to go to other countries to complete their research. Sure. And you would think like, the weather.
Yeah, why?
It's there. It's just like, it's the weather. SABC News archives, like these were all publicly broadcast. It's not like confidential information that we're trying to, it's like, and it's to further South African research, to further, homegrown type of stuff. So the one thing is helping perhaps at a governmental level or whatever level it is that, this type of access to data, and also you can have the right systems in place. Doesn't mean you must just willy-nilly share data with just everybody. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying like open your data to everybody, but I'm saying having open data does create a lot of opportunity. And so we need to start implementing processes to say, yes, government has a lot of data. If you want access to this data, here are the steps to access the data in the right way, in the right format. We need to at least make a move to that type of process. Other countries are talking about it. I think in the UK, they're talking about having this like massive government data set that private companies can kind of plug into without controlling the data, but almost like leveraging the data to build their models.
Yeah.
And so a lot of other countries are looking to see how do we leverage the data we already have it in a condition that researchers and people in the space can utilize it without us losing the control or giving it away or feeling like people are infringing on our data. So we do need to explore that a lot more, especially if we want to, get ahead in this type of space. I think we've always tried to keep everything very secure and like not allow that access. So we need to start looking at how do we change that in a responsible way. And the second thing is sometimes the data is just not there. It just doesn't exist, and we actually have to start being intentional about creating data sets. So companies like Lalapa AI, they are working on creating data sets of language. So getting homegrown speakers to create the models, to create those language, so that when you engage with these bots, it's not like, on Google Translate when you're trying to translate to an African language,
It says its own thing.
You know how it sounds. These are now homegrown models and data sets that they had to build literally by hiring people to speak the language to train the model to get the data, because the data doesn't exist. So it was like a very homegrown data set to the point where they are now, where they can start releasing these tools to corporates who can now, if you want to talk to customer service in whatever language, you can speak to them in your home language. You don't have to like try and figure out some mutual language that you both can speak. So it's going to have profound impact like that. But we do need to taking some very strategic steps to the current data we have. How do we allow responsible access to that data? And then secondly, how do we start even creating valuable data sets so that for the future, we don't have this conversation again 20, 30 years from now. All we're going to do is just keep falling further and further behind, whereas all these other countries where our smart researchers are going to do their research are getting further and further ahead.
Sure. That's interesting. So a lot of opportunities are also coming then especially in the research space, because AI, I suppose, is not just a technical tool where we are focusing on the technical aspect of it, but obviously it's a model that needs to be trained. And where is that information and that data coming from? So there's opportunities there as well.
The people who are building these tools, the models, training them, I mean, they are PhD plus, they are like super, super smart researchers who've done, like they're not just like your technical people. The people who are building on top of the tools, like your more like corporate type of environment, those I would say are your more technical type of people. But the people who are actually building the models often come from like a research heavy background.
Yeah, like the godfather of AI, the guy that worked at Google.
Jeffrey Hinton.
Yes. He was not having it when OpenAI released ChatGPT. And I suppose it's the work he knows he's put into this thing, and he was just so passionate about the research in that space that he felt the world is not ready to be dealing with this kind of technology.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure, that was a mouthful. Now let's talk about the work that you are doing at Lit Institute and how that came about. How did you find that, and the gaps, the things that you are doing through the Lit Institute? I guess a lot of it speaks to the work you are already doing. So when was it found, and how did you get into that space, and what do you do through that organization?
Sure. So, I mean, there were two journeys with Lit, and I think it comes back to our earlier conversation around authenticity and again, trying to be true to myself and what I should be doing that makes sense for me.
Yeah.
So the first time I left kind of corporate practice, which was back in 2017, I had this plan of going out there and educating others and not having a plan in terms of what to, but just knowing I want to be there and bridging that gap.
Yes.
Which I did do, and I did build a nice base, and that's kind of where Lit Institute first started. And Lit basically stands for Law, Innovation, Technology, Tomorrow. So law being my background, which is law, innovation being my interest, which is how do we take things forward, technology, which is my speciality and area of practice, and tomorrow being the future. Because I'm always looking at how the things of today are impacting the future. And so institute being like a learning, a place of learning, but my way of learning, not academia, not the way others are doing it,
Yes.
the way I feel it should be done. And that's how it first started. And at that time, I ended up also doing like some legal consulting work to the point where my business went back to the legal side and like ended up being like 90% legal and like 10% of the training. And so when opportunity came back to go back into a law firm and head up the tech and innovation space, it sounded like an exciting opportunity. So I took that, went back in, and then very soon realized again it wasn't for me and left again. But when I left again, which was last year, middle of last year, it was a lot more intentional.
Yeah.
And when I came back into the Lit Institute and kind of shook it off and rebooted it, I did it with a lot more intentionality, because this time it was like, this is it. Because, you know, the last time it was like, let me try something. Let me go and see what's out there. And it was going, but I wasn't maybe all in. And I went back into my comfort zone, which was like easy, like legal work. And then now I'm like, no. Like, that is not for me. This is for me. And we're going to make it work. And so it's been over a year now that I'm back as the Lit Institute. And it's been going really well. Yeah. It's been getting nice traction. And I'm already now in that space, you know, looking into next year and how are we going to evolve this even further?
Yes.
And what are we bringing into the next year in the space? And yeah, as I said, I'm doing it my way, where it's a lot of interactive sessions. I want learning to be fun. I want learning to engage your curiosity. I don't want your learning to stop when you come to my course. I want you to be so interested and have so many questions that you will continue to research by yourself. Yes. Because the world we live in today, knowledge is at your fingertips. It's just, it's about prioritizing and being interested and taking that effort to learn.
Yes.
And so my goal is to stimulate something in you to make you go out there and like grab those opportunities and keep yourself upskilled, because our career is no longer where you go to university, you study X, and then you work decades and you retire. You're going to have to continually now upskill yourself as tech changes. What's next? We have to get used to that way of doing things. Yeah. And so the Lit Institute wants to try and bridge that and help you on that journey while you're trying to upskill yourself and get to the next thing.
Wow, that's interesting and amazing. And so how do you, I think in my last question is then, how do we ensure, you know, with all this advancements and all this innovation, how can we best, or people, and just picking back off what you were just explaining, that you want to ignite that curiosity that yes, you are doing this course, but you are so ignited that you still want to carry on and do your further research or continue your studies further. How can we make sure that our skills, you know, we remain future fit for all of this innovation?
I think it comes down to trying to understand how is it going to impact you, not having a head in the sand approach, saying, these things, you know, I'm not going to be bothered. If we did that, we've already been through so many revolutions, like from pen and paper to typewriter to fax machine to computers pre-internet to email to Teams meetings. You know, before we used to drive everywhere to have a meeting. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Then COVID happened, and now we're just like, oh, I'll have a Teams. You know, it's like it's so simple, but doesn't mean we've lost the human-to-human connection. We know we still need to connect with others when necessary, but there's a lot of day-to-day stuff we can just do on the internet, and we've adapted. We're using the cloud, and the AI is a next progression, a big next progression, but it is a next progression. And then having the way you interact with your coworkers, now you're going to start interacting with AI like that. So I think it's also a mind shift that some of your colleagues are not just going to be humans. You may have AIs that is like your assistant, your helper, your editor, your whatever, and get used to having that type of engagement with the tool. And if you're open and you're open to learn, there's nothing to be really afraid of.
Wow. This was such an eye-opening, discussion. And thank you so much for joining us on the Lady Tech Africa podcast. We'll definitely be watching your journey as you continue to grow and evolve. So what's next for you?
What's next for me?
Yeah.
What's next for me is I'm also figuring out to practice what I preach and leverage the tech that I have and try to build a business that doesn't require me as much. Not that I'm not going to disappear, but a lot of what I'm currently doing requires me to show up. And I also need to get into more products and do things in a way that have almost a sustainable business where I can automate things can run in the background. When I need to show up, I'm there. But I want to have a lighter touch. But I'm still going to share my info. I'm still going to do it my way. I'm still going to give my energy. And so that's my next leap into next year is less of me being heavily in the business and using the tools I have to fill that gap.
Thanks so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed this. And thank you for listening and for watching. And if you are catching this on YouTube, comment down below. Let us know what you think of what we're discussing today. Share this episode with your communities and also make sure that you're subscribed. And if you're listening through your podcast platforms, make sure that you are following us and also engage there and tell us what you think of what we're talking about today. And see you at the next episode.
Thank you.